Hello and welcome to everyone on the line. We're so glad you could join us for today's webinar, Customs Update from ACE to Z. This event was organized by the United States Fashion Industry Association, representing brands, retailers, importers, and wholesalers based in the U.S. and doing business globally, as well as our friends at Euas. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our presenters for today. With us, we have Mary Jo Moyo, Senior Vice President of Trade Services at Euas. With us on the line, we also have Eileen Family and Aaron Williamson, Compliance Managers at Euas. My name is Shannon Brady, Communications Coordinator at USFIA, and I will be your moderator. Please note that questions can be submitted anytime during the live broadcast. Simply click on the question header on your webinar control panel, type your text into the box, and hit send. Our presenters will address as many questions as possible at the end of the program. If for some reason we experience a technical difficulty and lose audio, please refer to the chat box for further instructions. As a reminder, all registered participants will receive an email later today with a copy of the slide deck and a recording of today's session. So without further delay, I'll hand the floor over to Mary Jo.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. You know, we title these sessions Customs Updates from ACE to Z, but today it's really going to all be about C, obviously for the COVID-19 public health emergency. So there's an awful lot to talk about that. And for those of you that signed up when it was just me, your day just got better because, as you heard Shannon say, we have, I'm calling it special guest appearances from two of my colleagues, management folks from our trade services and our customs product division. So you guys are better off than just listening to me. I do want to say that while we're focusing on COVID, there are a lot of other things that are going on, and the association's been doing a great job of keeping people up to date, particularly on things around the 301 exclusions. If you have any questions about kind of the normal things in life, please just let us know. So I thought we would start off with, since it's all about COVID, the kind of how does one shelter in place? And what I thought was important for us is that we really encourage everybody to get up every day and put their real clothes on. No disrespect to our members that have a lot of pajamas in their line, but want the rest of us to get up and put real clothes on. Hopefully that means when this is all over, people are going to want to go out and buy more real clothes. So wear out your real clothes so we're all going shopping when this is over. Next. So one of the things that I did through a role I have through the Brokers Association is reached out to CBP with a list of things pretty early on in this process to say, hey, there's going to be disruptions to the trade, and wanted to engage with CBP around what can be done to mitigate some of those disruptions. So we submitted a whole bunch of things, considerations to CBP. The first of them was around payments. So the ask was, could there be extensions of payment periods for duties, taxes, fees, those types of things that are due at summary? Can this involve the extension of the obligation rather than just leniency in collection? So rather than keeping the same collection date or the due date, move the due date forward. Could it be done without interest? Could it be done without penalty? Also then talk to them about how about all the other money that has to be submitted to CBP? Can there be some grace periods, some extensions around that? So as most of you probably know, we did see some relief briefly. CBP issued what we kind of colloquially refer to in the trade as snow days. And there was a period of time there, about a week, where CBP was taking one-off requests, case-by-case consideration, and granting folks what amounted to no more than 7-day extensions. That was to be done without interest. It was to be done without penalty. There was a lot of interest pushing for and against this to be done on a longer-term, broader basis. There was a lot of pressure publicly and to the government. The problem became there were as many people pushing for extensions or deferments as there were for folks pushing against it. And it got very complicated. It got complicated because it became a situation where some duties were going to be able to be deferred and others not. Specifically, it looked like if this was to work, you'd be able to defer your normal or what we call MFN duties, but you wouldn't be able to defer what's relevant to this audience is 301 duties and anti-dumping countervailing duty. That became incredibly complex on how to construct a customs entry, how to construct a payment, how this would impact downstream processes. And just when we were all trying to figure out how to make it work, it looked like it's kind of been put aside for now from a political perspective. So it's off the table at the moment, but there are still a lot of trade interests and business interests pushing to have this done. So never say never. At the end of my part of our presentation, I've included links, and I'll point it out when we get to that slide, where CBP has published some information around COVID. In there are the CSMS messages that were issued for the deferment, that little temporary deferment that we had. They're helpful to look at because they point out how CBP handled it for that period of time. They also point you to the mechanism that was being used to pay. Just some things that if you get the sense that this is going to go forward, you could read these things over and perhaps get a little bit of preparation for how it might work next time if it was to happen. Next. Also, I wanted to give everybody a heads up that if you don't have your own ACH statement paying process right now, now might be the time to do that. There are some concerns that if this happens again, and if it is not a change of the obligation date, but a change in the collection policy, that it does not change the obligation for the broker to submit the duties independent of whether or not the client has paid. This is leading to some discussions around encouraging importers to be on their own statements. So if you have any questions about that, good information on your screen now. Also, just a good conversation to have with your broker. There's business reasons, kind of for and against, but CBP has issued some guidance around COVID. One of their guidances is around getting on ACH. So I wanted to put that information out there to you. Next. So we also went to CBP and said, hey, while we're all in this working remote world, could we make sure that CBP accepts payments and kind of liberalizes the way we can send payments in? Are there more things that could be done via pay.gov? Fedwire was the mechanism for paying those deferred statements that we talked about a minute ago. So this is an ongoing conversation with CBP, but now the time is important because most folks working from home kind of don't have a check writer, at the kitchen table with them. So we wanted to talk about, hey, are there other ways to get funds into CBP? Next. So we also, never let a good crisis go to waste. We figured let's ask, well, we want time to pay you, CBP. We want you to keep paying us timely. So we did point out to them that it's important that, to the extent possible, that the Revenue Division is still, in place to continue to issue refunds to folks. We just wanted to point out to them, I know drawback refunds are particularly important to certain folks, but heck, so can be protests and other monies you're getting back from CBP. So we basically kind of said we want our cake and eat it too. But we figured there's only one way to get that, and that's to continue to ask. And that's particularly important because there was some conversation around the fact that some government folks and CBP folks might end up being furloughed. And when they furloughed in the past, that has impacted the issuance of refunds out of the National Finance Center. So we wanted to get ahead of that. Next. So another big, kind of heading of things that we talked to CBP about was timelines and deadlines, and the fact that we're all disrupted because of our working environments and we're disconnected. So could we get some extensions around the resubmission of rejected entries? Sometimes the broker is handling that with you, but somebody's got to get some payments, somebody's got to get additional information. All that's becoming more difficult. Same with responses to requests for information and notices of action, things like that. Extensions of regulatory audit timelines. Maybe you're having a difficulty doing your annual notification letter on ISA or something like that. So just more leniency there. And additional time if you've gotten a bond insufficiency notice. So along the lines, CBP has issued a couple of policy notices and instructions via CSMS message. And these are helpful because they have national implications. And they sent one out around grace periods for March bond insufficiencies. So that was an example where a national guidance is helpful. CBP has told us from a headquarters level that where they are not issuing kind of national policy guidelines, that you are to work with the normal people you deal with every day at CBP, your local contacts, your center, whomever that might be, just work through usual channels. And we said to CBP, okay, but what would be helpful is if headquarters would send instructions out to the field to, anticipate an increase in requests coming from the trade and to feel comfortable considering and approving every reasonable request. So that they have told me that they will be getting that guidance out internally. And we hope that's the case. It just does help the person that you're dealing with on the other end of the phone or we're helping you with, just be comfortable to say, sure, take an extra 30 days or whatever the case might be. Obviously, if you need support, brokers can always help you bump it up to the next level. Next. So another heading of things, and some of these are a little bit more difficult for CBP to give than other, are extensions and leniency around meeting commitments for post-summary corrections, protests, prior disclosures. Prior disclosures, you can usually, get CBP to continue to kick that can down the lane a little bit and give you more time. Post-summary corrections and protests, some of those deadlines are statutory. So what we've said to CBP is, okay, if we're all up against a deadline, we're having a difficulty honoring it. We're not in the office. We don't have access to some of the same tools that we have. We don't have colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. You would want to work with CBP where you're filing your protest or your PSC and say, hey, can I file, my term, a skeleton one, a place saver one? Can I just get it in to meet the deadline? But will CBP, you'll know I'll be sending more information in later. So, an example of where they are willing to work with us, but sometimes there's a deadline you absolutely have to meet. Next. Another thing we've said to CBP is, and CBP, they're not in their office anymore either, and there's some hesitation in the public to be touching physical documents and things of this nature. So, plus I don't think they're all that anxious to give us their home addresses. So what do we do? In lieu of physical presentation of documents and samples and whatnot, can an IOU work? And there have been instances in the past where, catastrophic situations have closed offices and whatnot. And, CBP has really been able to kind of trust that you have it and say, okay, you can proceed as if you presented it to me, but when this resolves, you have X number of days to present it to me, and, kind of God help the person that takes advantage of it. But we've asked them, IOUs, copies in lieu of originals. Hey, CBP, I'll snap a picture of this. I've got the original here. I'll get it to you as soon as I can. And pictures rather than samples. So we did see a notice, one of the CSMS messages that came out talked about how to handle binding ruling requests while they're not in their office, you're not in your office, and they are not able to accept samples. They did say, try and, of course, use electronic mechanisms for filing your binding ruling and also submit pictures, drawings, things of this nature. I've anecdotally heard that apparel binding rulings, they're not necessarily eager to work on those until they have a physical sample. So you may find a situation where it's going to be put on hold until you can get that sample in. In other cases, you may have patterns and fit specifications and whatever else that are really good enough to allow them to issue that binding ruling. But they said don't send samples. They said that might impact their ability to process it. Along all these lines, CBP has issued one of the CSMS message that you'll see, kind of some tips for the trade for entry summary payment and post-release processing. A couple things that they recommend to do. One is to update your account and point of contact in the ACE portal. So if you have an ACE portal account, make sure that's current so they can find you. Submit supporting documentation to CBP through the DIS system. Your broker will help you get that done. Transmit post-summary activities like protests and things like that through ACE. And that if you've got a scenario where you have to pay duties, you may take the option of receiving a bill from CBP, or you can still mail payments into the port of entry. But again, we're trying to get them to allow alternate payment mechanisms. But you'll find that list of things in one of the CSMS messages, as well as the CSMS message around how to handle binding rulings. Next. One of the other things that we talked to CBP about was we have clients that have cargo arriving, and maybe you don't want to pay duty on it right now because your store is closed, or your your customer store is closed. So what can we do with this excess inventory? So we've talked to CBP about the rapid establishment of bonded facilities. So bonded warehouses are at a premium right now, and they may not be physically located where you would like them to be. So CBP is open to creative thinking on this topic. They're open to the creative thinking of saying, hey, I do operate a bonded warehouse, but it's in Chicago. I need one in Atlanta now. Can I adopt an Atlanta building temporarily while I go through the process of getting them formally set up as a bonded warehouse? What can we do to fast track a normal bonded warehouse application? What pieces of information or processes can CBP kind of put on hold or put aside temporarily, such like the physical review of the facility? Can they do that via Skype or something like that? CBP has the ability to set up a bonded GO warehouse instantaneously, effectively. So could they nominate a facility as a bonded facility, start it as a GO warehouse, and then convert that over to a bonded warehouse? And can container freight stations kind of morph into bonded facilities? So what I would say is if you've got a situation where you're running out of bonded space, do talk with your broker, get some creative ideas together, and then go to CBP and see what can be done. There's some things they feel comfortable waiving. There's some things they don't feel comfortable waiving, but some of the ones they don't feel comfortable waiving, like an employee list, are not the hardest of things to accomplish. So just know that there is some creativity going on out there. We've also asked CBP to perhaps be lenient in GO timelines. If people are having difficulty getting cargo off the pier, can there be an extended grace period for that? And just before this call started, I got an email from a broker friend of mine who had that very scenario right now and was looking for some additional time from CBP. So that's happening. Next, please. Another broad topic of things that we talked to CBP about was, oh my goodness, we're all busy enough right now. Do we have to throw more things on our plate? And there's implementations in various stages, and could that be postponed? So APHIS Core is on here not because it relates to your merchandise as much as the fact that it's a very, very involved deployment, and it will suck up a lot of resources. So we've asked them to kind of maybe put that on hold for the moment or extend mandatory use out further so people aren't distracted needing to comply with that. Fish and Wildlife, Geodis is a pilot in that right now, a pilot participant. But we've asked CBP and Fish and Wildlife if maybe that mandatory use could be extended. CPSC, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And Shannon, can you hear me? Because a little thing just popped up, said lost connection. I hope you can hear me.
Hi, Mary Jo. I can
again. Okay, great.
I think that's my mouth. Sorry about that.
Okay. So USMCA, that's taking up a lot of CBP's resources right now. Right now, their marching orders are to continue to be prepared for an early summer switch from NAFTA to USMCA. We've asked if perhaps that could be pushed back, or perhaps some of the more vexing parts of it to be pushed back. And there's an FTZ release, automated FTZ release that's coming out, and we've asked if they could maybe push that mandatory use back as well. So just, we've got a lot going on right now. Maybe now's not the time to kind of pile more on. Next. Another thing we talked to them about is flexibility with cargo diversions. We have seen, for instance, for a short period of time, some terminals in Houston were closed. There's problems in Anchorage that CBP's had to close offices there. There are processes in place for us when cargo has to be diverted, that CBP can kind of follow that entry from the original port of entry to the diverted port of entry. We just wanted them to be thoughtful about that and be prepared to maybe implement those if necessary. Recognition that those of us in the supply chain are essential businesses. So the Cyber Security Infrastructure and Security Agency at DHS publishes so far 2 versions of an advisory memorandum identification of essential critical infrastructure workers during the COVID-19 response. So that document is a federal guidance document that goes out to state and local jurisdictions for them to use when crafting their own stay-at-home type orders. So far, people in the supply chain, like your broker, like your distribution centers, your truckers, your port facilities, have been deemed essential, and we think that's helpful, so we can continue to get trade moving and try and keep businesses as viable as possible. So that's something that we also asked CBP to continue to encourage. And then, as you know, things have been postponed. If you or colleagues were studying for the April broker licensing exam, good news, you have more time to study. You have no social life right now, so you can all study like crazy. The exam is really probably going to be the October 8, 2020 exam. There's decreasing enthusiasm that they'll be able to get the April exam rescheduled. So if nothing else, study for an October 8 exam. The trade symposium, as you know, was postponed. It has been rescheduled for August 25th and 26th in Anaheim. It's a good time to be in Southern California. There are a variety of center outreach events. I know the Apparel Center had an outreach event that has been postponed or put off indefinitely. CBP was holding a trade exposition in New York, and some of that training would have involved some of your type of merchandise. That was April 2nd, that has been postponed. So, like everything else in our lives, certain things kind of being put on hold. Next. So, sticking with the C's, because it is CPSC, I did want to let you guys know that CPSC has selected Geodis to test with new functionality that's going to allow the broker to see more messaging about the actions that CPSC wants to take on your cargo. So we've been testing with them for a couple months now, and they look to roll this out to the larger broker and trade community in the summer. So what we see now is CPSC messages around under review, intensive, may proceed, those types of messaging that CPSC and Customs shared with each other, but those messages did not get passed on to the broker. So now we'll have a better idea of kind of who's interested in your cargo, how we can facilitate that exam if necessary. And it's impacting those types of products that are listed there. So this is a great thing, and we do look forward to this coming out in the near future. I mentioned earlier that Fish and Wildlife is also testing. They tested it's a different type of messaging with Fish and Wildlife. They do what's called the PGA message set. Geodis is a participant in this pilot right now also. This involves about 263 tariffs that are flagged for Fish and Wildlife or potential Fish and Wildlife. That's looking to go live in August 2020. Again, everything would be good if options were available, but not mandatory use was available. So we're encouraging CBP to the extent possible in those agencies just to hold off mandatory use. Next slide, please. So, okay, here are some resources. First one is a general tab for the CSMS messages. There are a wealth of information in there. You're going to get a lot of information that you don't need, but it is a good way to see. It's a primary communication mechanism that CBP uses. They also have a separate site for coronavirus, which does have a tab on it for CSMS messages. Unfortunately, not everyone is listed on the tab that they've put on this particular address. The one about binding rulings is missing, the ones about Anchorage and the ones about the bond sufficiency, they're missing, but they are included in the larger one. Everything's included in the larger one, the CSMS messages. So you've got those resources. You certainly have USFIA, who's been a fabulous resource, and we hope that Euas is a good resource to you as well. With that said, I had a funny call from a client, and we're all talking now about food and drug, brave new territory for many of us, aren't used to dealing with food and drug. Well, I had a call from a drug importer, client of ours, that had textile questions around these personal protective equipments, the gowns and whatnot. And she's like, oh my goodness, I haven't done textiles in 15 years. So it's a new world for everybody, whether you've never done FDA or whether you're FDA and you haven't done textiles in a while. It seems like everybody's having to deal with these issues. So with that said, we got some great material for you around the PPEs. And Shannon, I'm going to turn it over to Erin and Eileen, and thank everybody.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Erin Williamson. Shannon, you can go to the next slide already. Thanks. I hope everyone's families are well and you're safe during these crazy times. As Joe was just saying, we have enough unknown in our lives, and then many of you on top of that are dealing with FDA or bringing in FDA-regulated products for the first time. Next slide. So FDA hosted a webinar this past Monday and has an abundant amount of resources and documents on their website regarding the importation of medical devices being imported in support of the fight against COVID-19. And while all that information is extremely helpful, it can also be overwhelming to work through and to decipher the rules and regulations of what applies to your specific product. So what we've tried to do here is take all of that helpful information that we've reviewed over the course of the last few weeks and compile it into one reference document for the members. Things are changing quick, so what applies now may not apply tomorrow, unfortunately. So we do encourage you to stay on top of CBP's website, FDA's website for the most up-to-date information. So definitions, the first slide. Who doesn't love a good definition overview? And the biggest item that we have received at Euas are questions on the face masks, surgical masks, and respirators. Now, this information was directly pulled from FDA's website. And it's just a good reference tool to have when distinguishing between what you're looking at and what you're intending on importing. Or is it a surgical mask? Is it a face mask? Is it a respirator? All of these terms that we have definitely not had to deal with, or I haven't at least had to deal with ever. So it's just a really good reference tool to be able to read through and see what characteristics are behind that specific name. Next slide. And the same goes for the comparison between surgical masks and surgical respirators. Like I was just saying, up until a couple of weeks ago, I didn't know there were so many options for facial protection. And I didn't even know that, it was regulated by a few different government agencies based on what you were importing. So, it's just a good breakdown to go back to when your item could fall within a few different areas and you need to really analyze the correct rules and regulations that apply. Next slide.
Okay, so we're going to start out with the easy one, which is personal protective equipment, or what is referred to as a PPE. These are items that are used for general purpose or industrial use. That's your products that are not intended for use to prevent disease or illness. Some examples would be the masks that are used by your employees in your factories or warehouses. Although these masks are used to prevent the spread of disease to each other, FDA is not concerned about these right now. They're only concerned about items that are being used in hospitals and healthcare facilities. So if you have a PPE for these types of products, entry information should not be transmitted to FDA. At the time of import for these entries, importers should only transmit entry information to customs using the appropriate HTS number and then disclaim FDA. Next slide. Okay, so this is where it gets a little...
Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
Eileen. No, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Okay, so this is where now it's going to get a little tricky. So under Section 564 of the Federal Food and Drug Act, the FDA Commissioner has the authority to allow unapproved medical equipment or unapproved uses of medical equipment to be used in emergency situations. These are known as emergency use authorizations, or EUAs. So Erin's going to go over these EUAs in detail, but if your products do qualify under an EUA, FDA is required to be transmitted. So importers should transmit information to FDA under the intended use code 940000 along with the correct FDA product code. Next slide.
So as Eileen was just saying, and I jumped the gun a little bit, if you're dealing with medical products, it does get a little hairier trying to determine how you're importing it and what regulations apply. Fortunately for us, and of course, all the medical institutions and the fight against COVID-19, FDA has issued both emergency authorizations, which Eileen just went over, and also enforcement policies that ease the data requirements for importation into the U.S. If the emergency authorizations that we're going to cover in the presentation, they're specific to PPE, personal protective equipment, and even more specific to respirators and FFR that fall under that category. That's where we receive the most questions, and we just really wanted to deep dive into the EUA and what is specifically covered under the EUA regarding face masks and respirators. Respirators will fall under, you will have they will fall under both. There's an EUA for them and an enforcement policy. So it can get a little tricky determining, do I apply an EUA or do I apply the enforcement policy? So hopefully the next couple of slides will hopefully clear that up. Next slide, please. So the first group of respirators that are covered under the emergency authorization are NIOSH approved, which NIOSH is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, approved air purifying respirators that are typically used in an industrial type environment and that will now be utilized in a healthcare setting during the response to the COVID-19 public health emergency. The detail to the left and the links provided give you the complete scope of what is covered under this specific EUA. So I'm going to have Shannon jump into the first link just to give you guys an idea of what is covered. So if you work your way, you have your product, you're working your way through, you click on the link, and you go into, this is CDC's website. And I mean, there's just an abundance of products that are actually covered under this EUA. But if you go scroll all the way to the bottom, Shannon, look, there's 114 pages of products to look at and that actually qualify under the EUA. But again, it goes back to their air purified respirators that are NIOSH approved. So if you're dealing with a respirator, we encourage you to take a look at this list and see if your product falls under this specific EUA. I'm going to ask you to go back to the slide. They also approve ones that have passed shelf life, that they deemed are okay. There's also, decontaminated masks that are allowed. Again, the NIOSH approved air purifying respirators. So under this specific EUA, if you deep dive into the 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you find you don't qualify, you move on to the next one. Next slide. The next round that we're dealing with are imported non-NIOSH approved disposable filtering face piece respirators, or FFRs. These are a specific list of authorized respirators from other countries that have been approved for use during the response to COVID-19. We have seen that first grid to the left that has Brazil and Mexico. That was initially listed on the document that came out from FDA. Recently, the next grid to the right was issued. So this is ever changing as people apply for EUAs, and we're going to get into that a little later. But again, if you're not specifically listed, if you don't have a respirator that is detailed on this list from the countries listed, you do not apply under this specific EUA. Next slide, please. You also have non-NIOSH approved disposable filtering face piece respirators, FFRs, that have been manufactured in China. We get a lot of questions about the KN95 from China, but what has been approved under the EUA is specifically broken down in that table, and that is pulled directly from that download link below. So if you have a respirator that you're bringing in from one of those manufacturers and that specific model, then you're covered under the EUA. Outside of that, you're more than likely going to fall under the, oh my goodness, I'm blanking on, there's so many, what Eileen's going to cover, the enforcement policy. Apologize. So again, if you're bringing in from China, it's the respirator. Look at this list. If you don't qualify, you move on. Next slide, please. You can still apply for an EUA. There's a series of details that need to be provided as listed in the email, as listed in the slide. You send an email to the CDRH, non-diagnostics, EUA templates at FDA.hhs.gov with all of the information required. And we hear that it takes about a few days, 3 days to hear back regarding your approval. But again, that's the only way to get approved under the EUA is to request it. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eileen again.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so you might be thinking that you have some products coming in and you don't think they qualify under the EUA. But you don't need to worry about that because they could still qualify, or they most likely will still qualify under the enforcement discretion policy. Next slide. So the enforcement discretion policy helps to expand the availability of needed items that are used by healthcare professionals in emergency situations such as the one we are in right now. So this slide will provide links to all of the items that most of you are probably bringing in. And if they don't qualify for an EUA, they most likely will qualify under here. So each of these links you can click on and it will show you all the guidelines. So Shannon, can you click on the face masks? Yeah. So you open this up and it's a pretty long enforcement policy, but what you really need to look at is this table that shows, you could read through the whole thing, but we're at this table right here, table 1. This shows you all the items that do qualify under this policy. So you can bring in your surgical masks, you can bring in your N95s, you can bring in your respirators under this policy. Okay, you can go back. So items that do qualify under the enforcement policy are still regulated by FDA, and FDA still wants to see that information. So when you're importing these products, you would transmit your customs entry with entry information submitted to FDA under intended use code 081006, which is different than the one we spoke about earlier, along with your FDA product code. Okay, next slide. So we picked a few of the items that we get a lot of questions about. I know the WTO or WCO has a document that provides some HTS numbers, but they don't give the full 10-digit HTS number, and they also don't advise duty rates or things like that. So we just provided this little slide here, which gives the most popular items that people tend to be bringing in, and we included the 10-digit HTS number along with the regular rate of duty, whether or not it has an exclusion, and then if it does have an exclusion, the exclusion number. Something to remember is that these items still are eligible for duty if there is a regular ad valorem duty rate. So any exclusions only apply to the Section 301 duties. They do not apply to the normal rate of duties. Next slide. Okay, and then lastly, we want to talk about the export certificate that is required for items that are coming out of China. I want to note that this is a China requirement. It is not a U.S. requirement. So U.S. FDA and Customs are not looking for this. It is just required in order to get your products out of China. So we were advised of this on April 1st, 2020, and it's an announcement on the orderly development of the medical supplies export, which was issued by the China Ministry of Commerce. And it's regarding the export of medical supplies from China. So it includes exports of masks, protective clothing, respirators, and thermometers, which require a written or electronic statement confirming that the equipment has a product registration certificate and that it meets the requirements of the quality standards of the importing country. These quality control measures are specific to export of medical supplies from China, and they may be adjusted according to the course of the epidemic. So manufacturers in China producing medical supplies should register with the China National Medical Products Administration in order to obtain this product registration certificate so that they can export these products to the U.S. Next. And that concludes our presentation on FDA requirements for medical supplies during this COVID-19 period.
Great, thank you. And thank you again, Erin, Eileen, and Mary Jo for your presentation. We're now going to turn the floor over to our audience for questions, and we're going to start with those submitted during the live presentation. We do encourage all attendees to continue submitting questions using your dashboard. So our first question, can you give any insight on Tranche 4A exclusion requests? Are those still being reviewed?
Erin, do you have that information?
Sorry, go ahead, Eileen.
Is it list 4A they were referring to?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, so they are still being reviewed. We have not seen, I don't believe we've seen any action on any of those so far. The period to request an exclusion has been closed since January 31st, but the USTR is still reviewing them and, deciding whether or not they're going to be granted or denied.
There was, I have the list up in front of me, so I'm just going to quickly go in and I think there was one, it was recent, and I think it had to do with the list that was the last, it falls under 9903, 8839. There's two exclusions that are out there for it, 9903, 8839, 42, and 44. So I apologize, three lists have been issued against 4A, but as Eileen said, they're still being reviewed.
Great, thank you guys. The next question, do you predict that the administration would dismiss or defer duties on medical equipment being imported to the U.S. for COVID-19?
Well, I can't speak of. I can just say that there has been a lot of exclusions for medical equipment. Not everything has been excluded, but I know that there has been a lot, but I have not heard about them eliminating normal rates of duty.
Great, thank you. So we're going to give attendees just another minute to submit any other questions. But do you have any other final recommendations for brands and retailers, as they kind of face the disruptions that have come with COVID-19?
My final thought would be just don't be afraid to think outside the box right now, that there is a willingness on the part of government and certainly industry to put all our heads together, do something different than the normal. So no idea is a bad idea. Just throw it out there to the right parties.
Great, thanks, Mary Jo. And it doesn't look like we have any last minute questions. So with that, we are going to conclude today's webinar. Thank you again to Mary Jo, Eileen, and Erin. And as a quick reminder to attendees, you will receive a follow-up email containing the slide deck and a recording of today's program. Please don't hesitate to reach out to USFIA with any additional questions. You can always reach us directly by emailing us at info@usfashionindustry.com. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to hosting you at the next USFIA event.